The forest was thick with fog. Daniel shivered, pulling his thin jacket tighter. He hated this forest, always had. Now the setting sun cast long, grotesque shadows through the trees. His breath plumed out in front of him, a ghostly white against the encroaching darkness. He pushed on, deeper into the woods. The path was barely visible, swallowed by years of neglect and encroaching undergrowth. Each step was a battle against tangled roots and damp leaves. The air grew colder, heavy with the smell of damp earth and decaying wood. A shiver ran down his spine. This was a fool's errand. He should turn back, but he couldn't. Not yet, not until he knew. The image of Mark flashed in his mind, his friend's face etched with worry. Mark, who had vanished into this cursed forest a week ago. Daniel quickened his pace, driven by a mixture of fear and grim determination. The fog seemed to press in closer, a suffocating blanket against his skin. He could hear the faint rush of the river now, its sound distorted by the thick air. The sawmill loomed out of the fog, a skeletal silhouette against the dying light. It stood on the edge of the riverbank, its once proud timbers now rotted and broken. The windows were dark, empty sockets staring out at the encroaching forest. The place had been abandoned for decades, left to crumble into dust and memory. Locals said it was cursed, said it was haunted. Daniel hesitated at the edge of the clearing. A cold breeze swept through the ruins, whistling through the gaps in the walls. Taking a deep breath, he stepped into the clearing. The ground was littered with debris, rusted machinery, broken planks of wood, shattered glass. He approached the main building cautiously. The silence inside was almost deafening. It pressed down on him, suffocating. He could hear the blood pounding in his ears, his own ragged breathing. He shone his flashlight around the room, the beam dancing over cobwebs and shadows. The floor was littered with debris, the remnants of a life long gone. A rusted saw blade lay half buried in the floorboards, its teeth dulled with time. As he ventured deeper into the mill, he thought he heard something. A faint whisper carried on the breeze. He stopped, holding his breath, listening intently. There it was again. A soft sigh, close to his ear. He spun around, his heart racing. But there was nothing there. He told himself it was just the wind playing tricks on him. But deep down a primal fear coiled in his gut. He was not alone here. The air hung heavy and still within the sawmill, thick with the ghosts of sawdust and decay. The musty odour of rotting wood filled Daniel's nostrils, catching in his throat like a phantom hand. He pointed his flashlight beam towards the far wall, its weak light barely penetrating the oppressive darkness. There, scrawled in what looked like charcoal, were names and dates. Some were recent, etched into the wood with a desperate hope of leaving a mark on the world. Others were faded with time, mere whispers of lives long gone. A sudden noise echoed from deeper within the mill, a sharp cracking sound that sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He froze, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. He had to find Mark. The flashlight beam danced across the dusty floor as Daniel cautiously moved deeper into the sawmill's heart. He stopped, his eyes drawn to a patch of disturbed sawdust near the base of a rusted conveyor belt. The sawdust was scattered in a wide arc, as if something heavy had been dragged across the floor. He crouched down, examining the area more closely. There were no footprints, no signs of a struggle, just the disturbed sawdust, a mute testament to whatever had transpired here. Daniel's hand trembled as he gripped the flashlight tighter. He had to get a grip. Panicking wouldn't help him find Mark. The flashlight beam landed on something lying on the ground near the far wall. It was a glint of silver, reflecting the weak light. He moved towards it cautiously, his steps slow and deliberate. As he drew closer, he recognized the object. It was a silver locket shaped like a heart. He picked it up, his fingers brushing against the cool metal. He recognized the locket instantly. It was Mark's. He had given it to his girlfriend, Emily, just a few weeks ago. What was it doing here? He flipped the locket over, his thumb running over the engraved initials on the back M and E. A wave of nausea washed over him. This was more than just a missing person case. The locket felt heavy in Daniel's hand, cold against his palm. Mark's locket. His friend's initials seemed to burn into his skin. He clutched it tight, a tangible link to the man he desperately hoped was still alive. The silence of the sawmill pressed in on him, a suffocating blanket of dread and despair. He ran his thumb over the silver heart, tracing the outline of the initials. A wave of dizziness washed over him, and for a moment he could have sworn the air grew colder. The scent of sawdust and decay intensified, tinged with something else, something metallic and sharp, the smell of blood. He shook his head, trying to clear the image forming in his mind. He was letting the atmosphere get to him, letting the darkness whisper doubts into his ear. Mark was fine. He had to be. Maybe he had been hurt, gotten lost in the woods. But deep down, a chilling certainty took root. The locket wasn't lost. It was left. A message. A warning. Daniel slipped the locket into his pocket, the metal a cold comfort against his skin. He had to find out what happened to Mark, even if it meant facing the growing fear that threatened to consume him. The sawmill seemed to pulse around him, the air thick with unseen menace. He moved deeper into the mill, following a narrow corridor that snaked between towering stacks of rotting planks. The floor was treacherous, littered with debris and slick with dampness. As he walked, he thought he heard whispers, faint and indistinct like voices carried on the wind. The whispers reached a fever pitch, a cacophony of voices swirling around Daniel's head. He stumbled back, pressing himself against the rough-hewn timbers of the corridor wall. The flashlight beam wavered, casting grotesque shadows that danced and twisted in the darkness. He could feel the mill's presence now, a palpable entity pressing in on him from all sides. His breath came in ragged gasps, his chest tight with fear. He had to get out, now. The touch was feather-light, yet it sent a jolt of pure terror through Daniel's entire body. It was like being touched by ice, a bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep into his very marrow. He ripped his arm back with a gasp, stumbling away from the unseen grip. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the suffocating silence of the sawmill. He spun around, wildly swinging his arms in the darkness, desperate to connect with whatever had touched him. But there was nothing there. Only the oppressive darkness and the feeling of unseen eyes watching his every move. He was surrounded, hunted in the heart of the abandoned mill. "Mark!" he called out, his voice hoarse and thin in the vast emptiness. As Daniel's eyes slowly adjusted to the darkness, he began to discern faint shapes and outlines in the gloom. The towering stacks of lumber loomed like silent sentinels, their rough edges barely visible in the faint light filtering through cracks in the boarded-up windows. The air was thick with the dust of ages, catching in his throat with every panicked breath. He remembered the whispers, the chilling voices that had seemed to emanate from the very walls of the mill. Were they warnings? Were they trying to guide him or lead him further into danger? He couldn't be sure. But one thing was clear, he was not alone in this decaying tomb of timber and shadows. He continued to stumble through the darkness, his arms outstretched, his fingers brushing against rough wood and cold metal. Then he heard it again, a faint scratching sound like claws on wood coming from somewhere above him. Terror lent speed to Daniel's movements. He scrambled back, tripping over a loose plank and falling hard against the unforgiving wooden floor. The wind was knocked out of him, and he lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, his mind reeling as the shadowy figure descended closer. He had to get up, had to run, but his limbs felt like lead, heavy and unresponsive. He could see it more clearly now, the moonlight revealing a grotesque parody of a human form. It was skeletal, its limbs elongated and twisted at unnatural angles. Its head lolled at an impossible angle, and two empty sockets seemed to stare down at him with a malevolent hunger. He finally managed to scramble back, pushing himself away from the creature with a desperate cry. He could hear his own pulse pounding in his ears, drowning out all other sounds. He had to find his flashlight, had to find a weapon, anything to defend himself against the nightmare that was closing in. As he scrambled back, his hand brushed against something cold and metallic. His flashlight. He snatched it up, his fingers fumbling with the switch. A beam of light pierced the darkness, illuminating the creature just as it lunged. He screamed, scrambling back, the light catching the creature's face for a fleeting moment. The creature shrieked, a high-pitched, inhuman wail that reverberated through the sawmill. Daniel shielded his eyes from the light, his heart hammered in his chest. When he lowered his hand, the creature was gone. The only evidence was the lingering echo of its shriek and the faint scent of decay. He was alone again, terror gripping him. He shone his flashlight around the room, his heart pounding with every flicker of shadow, every creak of the ancient structure. He had to get out of here, but which way to go? He was utterly lost in the labyrinthine heart of the mill. As he swept the beam of his flashlight across the floor, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. A trail of sawdust, disturbed as if something heavy had been dragged across it, led away from him and deeper into the mill's shadowy depths. It was a trail of hope and terror, a path that could lead him either to safety or to whatever awaited him in the heart of the abandoned sawmill. Daniel hesitated, his hand trembling as he gripped the flashlight. The trail of sawdust beckoned him forward, a silent invitation into the belly of the beast. Fear warred with a desperate hope, the hope that this trail might lead him to Mark, that his friend might still be alive somewhere within this decaying labyrinth. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. He couldn't stay here, paralyzed by fear. He had to find Mark, even if it meant confronting whatever lurked in the shadows. He stepped forward, his footfalls echoing in the silence, following the sawdust trail like a lifeline. The air grew colder, the scent of decay intensifying with each step. The trail led him deeper into the mill, past rusting machinery and piles of rotting lumber, the air thick with dust motes dancing in the weak beam of his flashlight. The silence was broken only by the sound of his own breathing and the creaking of the ancient structure around him. The trail took a sharp turn, leading him down a narrow corridor. The walls seemed to close in on him, the ceiling lower here, as if he were descending into the bowels of the earth. The air hung heavy, thick with a palpable sense of dread. He could feel his pulse quickening, his skin prickling with a cold, primal fear. The corridor opened up into a large, cavernous room. The air was thick with the scent of decay and something else, something metallic and sharp, the smell of blood. Daniel froze, his blood turning to ice in his veins. He shone his flashlight around the room, his heart sinking with each passing second. And then he saw him. Mark lay slumped against the far wall, his body still, his eyes closed. His clothes were torn, his skin deathly pale, and a dark stain marked the ground beneath him. Daniel rushed towards him, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. "Mark! Mark, can you hear me?" Daniel dropped to his knees beside his friend, gently shaking his shoulder. There was no response. Mark's chest rose and fell with shallow, ragged breaths, but his eyes remained closed. He was alive, but barely. Daniel frantically searched for his phone, his hands shaking so badly he could barely dial. He had to get help, had to get Mark out of here. As he lifted the phone to his ear, he noticed something lying on the ground next to Mark. It was the silver locket, lying open, its two halves reflecting the dim light of his flashlight. And then he saw it. A single long black hair was caught in the locket's hinge. A cold dread washed over Daniel. The hair was long and straight like Emily's, but it wasn't blonde. It was black as night, as black as the shadows that clung to the corners of this accursed place. His mind reeled as a horrifying realization dawned. Emily wasn't a victim in this nightmare. She was the architect. The whispers, the shadows, the creature in the darkness. They hadn't been protecting the sawmill. They had been protecting Emily, shielding her from discovery, from the consequences of her dark desires. She had used this place, this legend, to hide her true nature, to lure her victims to their doom. He remembered the stories, the local legends of the sawmill and the spirits that haunted it. He had always dismissed them as superstitious nonsense. But now he understood. The sawmill was a conduit, a place where the veil between worlds was thin, where darkness could bleed through and claim the unwary. And Emily had found a way to tap into that darkness, to wield it as a weapon. He looked down at Mark, his friend's face pale and drawn, his life slowly ebbing away. He had to get Mark out of here, had to expose Emily for the monster she truly was. But deep down, he knew it was already too late. The sawmill had claimed them both. The sound of sirens echoed in the distance, a faint beacon of hope in the encroaching darkness. Daniel sat beside Mark's still form, his face pale in the flashing lights. He spoke of shadows, whispers, and a locket with a terrifying truth. Emily's body was found days later, drowned in the river. The silver locket was still clutched in her hand. The police ruled it a suicide, but Daniel knew the truth. The sawmill had claimed her, as it had others before. And as he walked away, the fog closed in behind him. He could have sworn he heard a faint whisper, like Emily's voice. The sawmill had claimed another soul,